Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today we've been doing a series of episodes on some very unique and very cool cEDH decks that you won't find on the decklist database, something starkly different than the run-of-the-mill list you're used to seeing and playing against. These are Hot Brews, a series on Gemstone Mine where we will be talking with the people who are brewing some of the hottest and most innovative decks in and around the cEDH metagame. If you've ever thought about giving cEDH a try, but thought it was just a bunch of Grixis decks trying to win first, or you never really found that list that spoke to you, maybe some of these brews will inspire you to give it a shot. And of course, it wouldn't be an episode of Gemstone Mine without some useful lessons from cEDH that you can take away for your own deck building and gameplay, whether you play cEDH or at more casual tables. And I am delighted to introduce our latest guest on Hot Brews, DJ Yavimaya. Welcome.
Hey, happy to be here.
Why don't you introduce yourself, DJ? Where might people know you from?
Yes, people might see my name around on various Discords for cEDH. Been pretty active in the online community for I don't know, five or 6 years now. I mean, over on Twitter, I tweet sometimes. DJ Yavimaya is my handle there. Same for Discord. Maybe most known for my work with Yorn, God of Winter these days. Though I played cEDH Food Chain for a long time in the past.
I can see how you wound up on Yorn then. That is a really fun deck to play against, even when you stasis lock me out of the game.
Yeah, I like those unique interactions.
And I think that certainly shows in some of your portfolio of your decks.
Yeah.
So what kind of other decks do you enjoy playing?
So I also got an Atraxa That's like my new food chain deck that I don't really play cEDH anymore. So Atraxa is kind of the upgrade, the 2023 version.
Atraxa Grand Unifier then. Okay.
Yes. Not Proliferate. But I definitely prefer blue based decks. I played Legacy for a really long time, mostly blue green Infect, and just in general really feel comfortable with having that stack interaction. Feels like it gives me that consistency that I want, that non-blue decks don't feel the same in.
So getting on from there then, you brought us a really, really interesting brew today in your Tameshi Reality Architect deck. I'm going to read Tameshi real quick for people at home who may not be familiar with yet another one of the interesting legends that came out of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Tameshi is a 2/3 for 2 and a blue legendary creature Moonfolk Wizard with, whenever one or more non-creature permanents are returned to hand, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn and X a white and return a land you control to its owner's hand, return target artifact or enchantment card with a mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. So I'm sure a lot of people want to ask, why Tameshi?
Yeah, so Tameshi, I think, got overshadowed a lot by the printing of another strong AZORIUS commander in the same set there with Shorakai. Shorakai was in the commander product, but same release.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried Shorakai for a little bit, but it felt almost too generic for me to really capture my interest as far as brewing.
Mm-hmm.
I also found I sort of missed that graveyard synergy that cEDH had given me for a long time, but I sort of lost when I stopped playing cEDH. So Tameshi being able to pull value from the graveyard kind of scratched that itch for me, in addition to being a bit of a new direction for me with this blue-white control strategy, because I had been playing Sultai mid-range stuff for so long.
Right. So what exactly about Tameshi caught your eye? What really brought you in to say, I really want to work on this deck?
Yeah, so one thing I've really found that I love is just having a cheap commander. I joke sometimes that I really enjoy playing decks that can be cast off land plus mana crypt. Play Yorn. That's a 3-color deck with a 2 and a color casting cost. Tameshi's the same. I played Malcolm Tana for a while. So having those cheap commanders that provide some sort of value as well along with them, I really find that that's something that feels really strong to me in Commander. Just always having that card in your hand and being able to play it relatively early and consistently feels really strong.
Some people might look at Tameshi and ask, how is that drawing value? Can only draw you a card once a turn.
Yeah, so the nice thing is that the second ability feeds the first one, right? Its floor is almost like you're getting like a Phyrexian Arena, and then if somebody else bounces something during their turn, if somebody casts a Chain of Vapor, you get to draw a card out of that. And then beyond that, the recursion that Tameshi provides to reuse things like Seal of Removal. You can use a Seal of Removal every turn to keep somebody locked out of using their commander. A Seal of Cleansing.
There's probably a lot of these are ones that do not see a ton of play in cEDH. So this was a cycle of enchantments, I think, that came out of the Planar Chaos?
Ooh, no,
Was
I
it?
think it was
E-
it was earlier than that. I think it was a
oh no, you're right. It
prophecy.
was in
Is it
Invasion.
Invasion? Yeah, somewhere around
Yeah,
there.
so Seal of Removal, for example, is a single blue mana for an enchantment with sacrifice Seal of Removal, return target creature to its owner's hand. While Seal of Cleansing is 1 and a white, with an enchantment, sacrifice Seal of Cleansing, destroy target artifact or enchantment. I'm going to be very specific with things like this to make sure that we are always identifying what is part of the cost and what is part of the
Mm.
effect of the card because as I think DJ is likely to going to get into shortly, Tameshi is worded in such a way that the cost really, really matters on the card. But yeah, these are definitely cards that you do not see a lot of in cEDH. Why do you think they don't see a lot of play outside of your deck? And what does your deck offer as a way to take advantage of them?
Yeah, so I think a big part for the seals that you just described, some other cards that we'll get into, is the sorcery speed nature of them as an upfront cost. You have to develop them on your turn, which in the early parts of the game can sometimes be a drawback, but as the game progresses, if you've already developed them, they actually become powerful onboard rattlesnakes for opponents trying to develop towards their win. Now you're showing them, don't do that. I have an onboard answer to it. And then even if you have to pop them to stop an opponent from gaining too much value, then Tameshi just rebuys it the next chance that you get, so you can just keep utilizing a seal. Or another example is something like Soul Guide Lantern. You can keep hitting graveyards if you need to as the game progresses, and that lets you disrupt like breach decks. They don't have any fuel in the graveyard when they try to go off.
Very, very cool. So, what are some of the strengths of this deck?
Yeah, so obviously reusing those cards that I just mentioned that have a lot of synergy with the commander is great. Because so many of the powerful cards in the deck are cards that can be recurred with Tameshi, you actually kind of lower the exposure of those cards to your opponent's interaction because you can rebuy them so easily. I play my Rhystic Study and it gets interacted with. I can get that back, making it a really difficult to deal with threat. And the same kind of deal goes with a lot of the win cons in the deck, because so many of the pieces for those win cons are things that Tameshi gets back. And for some of them, all of the cards involved in a particular win con are completely recurable with Tameshi. So even if you stop me on one turn, almost regardless of how I get stopped, barring like pieces getting exiled, like I can do it again, right? And so destroy or bounce effects really aren't great permanent solutions to Tameshi.
And I think we've all kind of had that feeling when we try to stop somebody, and our only way to stop them is with a bounce spell like Chain of Vapor. We know we've got one turn to figure it
Yeah,
out.
right. And then Tameshi kind of takes that to another level. It's like the combo. We'll describe. I'm sure we'll go over the combos more specifically, but if one combo that uses a bunch of artifacts and enchantments, and you have a Beseju in hand, it's like, that's cool. I'll get a land from Beseju, and then I'll use that land to activate Tameshi again and get the card back. Can we try it again?
Oh, that's really cool. That is pretty darn cool.
The other side of that is there's some powerful hate pieces that the deck gets to play. Like Grafdigger's Cage and Torpor Orb, I think are really, really good right now.
Yeah.
Docksides, Breaches, Winotas, all that stuff.
I mean, Torpor Orb is even like sneakily better now in a post Bowmaster world. Like filing 1 off the potential damage that Bowmaster does, that's really good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to get two Bowmaster triggers in a turn, I feel, but the 3 is, in my experience, kind of where that cutoff of this is easy to achieve and this doesn't happen often. So if you can make it so that a surprise Bowmaster can't take Tameshi off the table, that's definitely a bonus.
Absolutely, but why don't we talk about some of the weaknesses the deck faces?
Azorius has that sort of bad reputation of lacking that raw power that some even some other 2-color combinations, but obviously higher color combinations have. Lack of generic tutors that black would give access to. Even green, has a pretty deep suite of creature tutors to give it consistent access to all those cards. And obviously the explosiveness of red, missing Dockside, missing Underworld Breach. Let me tell you, if Tameshi could play Underworld Breach, that would be incredible.
Oh, God, yeah.
1 breach attempt fails. All right, we're going to try this again next turn.
That's pretty nuts.
The other thing is, like, specific to Tameshi more so, is it tends to cannibalize its own land drops by using that second ability. So obviously you can only get 1 land a turn, and if you're activating Tameshi even just once a turn, you're not, getting ahead on land drops. So when you get to those later stages of the game, you might find yourself with only 2 or 3 lands in play, and that can sometimes come back to bite you. So it's not something that can't be combated as far as minimizing the impact, but it's something to be aware of when building around Tameshi and when playing your games, to not overuse Tameshi initially or in the early stages of the game so that you're not lower on resources later when you need big impactful turns where you might want to spend a bunch of mana and activate Tameshi multiple times.
Well, why don't we use that then as a jumping off point? You kind of talked about there's a right time to activate Tameshi, and I'm going to assume that that means there's also a right time to develop Tameshi. So what does the game plan of this deck look like? What are those early turns like?
With any sort of control or control adjacent deck, the first step is obviously to not lose, because you can't take over the late game if you let the turbo deck go off early. So you're typically prioritizing in those first turns. You're prioritizing, I want to develop mana, and I want to be able to have some way to interact with the table, whether that's a hate piece like Draenith or the Grafdigger's Cage, Torpor Orb that we discussed earlier, an onboard seal of removal or seal of cleansing to disrupt certain combos, some way to make sure that you can get out of those early turns with your head still on your shoulders.
That is very true. I didn't think I liked Azorius until I started playing Vol, and then I kind of fell in love with the color combination. And first, don't lose is a very, very sage piece of advice for people to take away from this episode.
Honestly, I feel like it's a good philosophy that can be applied to really any deck and play style too. Like, a lot of times I notice people are not necessarily valuing not losing enough, because they're trying to think, well, I need to win now, without really realizing that the first step to winning is to avoid losing because there's 3 other people at the table.
Even at more casual tables where the game doesn't end so abruptly quite so often, you do still see that mentality of, I'm going to put my head down and put my blinders on and develop my game plan. only to look up 3 turns later and go, wait, when did the green player get 30 creatures on board? And
Absolutely.
just having that sense of awareness of what's going on at the table around you and the willingness to slow down at half turn, interact with the
Yep.
problems that are presenting themselves,
Yep.
and then
Yep.
going forward from there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you brought up a really interesting point earlier, describing how you're using those seals and baubles, which are not part of the regular arsenal that we see in a lot of cEDH decks. And the threat that they present is actually very similar to a card we do see a lot in cEDH in the form of Ranger Captain of Eos,
Yep.
which
Yep.
on ETB it gets you a 1-drop, but importantly, when you sacrifice it, it provides a nice silence effect.
Yeah. Absolutely.
What is your experience like playing this wider suite of cards in that vein?
Obviously the effects aren't the same, but they can sometimes warp how the table ends up playing around them because they don't want to go for a breach win when there's a seal of cleansing in play. Put the breach on the stack and it resolves, and then you cast the LED from that you had in hand, right? And then I go, nope, breach is gone. In the same way, you don't want to play a creature combo into a seal of removal because you might not be able to execute it depending on the combo. Tap out for an expensive commander into a seal of removal that you just wasted all your mana, and now there's another win attempt. So it can force the rest of the table to kind of play a little bit more responsibly, which I think, in my experience, tends to favor the deck that's trying to control the table.
That's a really, really good point. Another thing I've noticed with these types of cards, not in cEDH but at other tables, is that they are usually not the kind of thing that is going to draw defensive or offensive counter magic. These are the kinds of cards that when you cast them, they're going to resolve. Whereas if you were the person who was going to do a Nature's Claim in response to Breach coming down, you better believe that thing's getting countered.
Yep, yep, yeah. People have a tendency, and I don't think it's necessarily a wrong play pattern. There's a tendency to not interact with things that don't necessarily lose you the game now or in the near
Right.
future. Especially given the multiplayer nature, you're not incentivized to interact one for one with a seal of removal if it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't immediately hurt you.
Now, these aren't the only really out there cards you're running in the deck. You are also on a few other ones here. Why don't you tell us about some of your favorites that made it into your list that you won't see in every cEDH list on the database?
Yeah, there's some pretty cool ones in here. Hedron Crab is hilariously strong in this deck a lot of the
Isn't that
times.
isn't that the landfall mill crab?
Yes.
So I've seen it before in some like landfall decks. I was not aware of it being a powerhouse in cEDH. Tell me more.
So face value, landfall mill target player 3. Typically what you're doing with this is you're milling yourself so that you can dig to find those powerful artifacts and enchantments that you want to find. Play a land, mill myself 3, and find that Rhystic Study, because you just have really good card velocity by dumping 3 cards into your graveyard that Tameshi can get the things that you want back out. Fetch lands become really, really good because you get to see 6 cards, so that's digging really deep for Tameshi. And then the additional value for Hedron Crab is that it actually can serve as an outlet for one of the combos for the deck. So not only does it help you assemble that combo, it will let you outlet the combo without needing another card when you finally get to that stage where you're winning the game.
All right, mental note to ask you about that in a couple of minutes.
Yep. I've absolutely found Hedron Crab off my Ranger Captain over Esper Sentinel in certain games.
Oh, you're getting me excited about this nonsense, DJ. I love it.
Speaking of landfall, Surveyor's Scope is another one that's just so huge in this deck as far as what it
All right,
brings to the
that one
table.
I am gonna read for the folks at home.
Yeah,
Surveyor's Scope is an artifact out of C13, was
I think so.
it?
It's an
Yeah,
oldie.
originally out of Commander 2013. A 2-mana artifact with tap, exile, Surveyor's Scope. Search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the number of players who control at least 2 more lands than you. Put those cards onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library.
Yeah, so this card is basically always 2 mana, put 3 untapped basics into play in practice. Not only is it like, it's a ritual, right? It's mana positive more often than not, because if you're using Tameshi every turn, you get to turn 4, you only have
Oh
one
my
or two.
god, now I see it.
You only have 1 or 2 lands in play. Everyone else has 3 or 4. It's like guaranteed to catch you right back up.
Oh, that's hot.
That gives you so many more land drops to use for your Tameshi. So it's one of the cards on the deck that really helps with that idea I was talking about earlier of Tameshi cannibalizing its own land drops. So this recuperates. It tends to recuperate like all of the ones that you're behind on in a single shot for only 2 mana. And then if you mill it, it's an artifact. If you mill it, you can get it back at play. It's 3 landfall triggers for Hedron Crab. This is a Mystic Sanctuary deck, so you get 3 basic islands in play, and your Mystic Sanctuary is already online. It does so many good things.
That's really cool. I was wondering about that one in the deck, but when you pointed out that you are pretty much always bouncing your lands back to hand, oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. The only thing that could be better about it is if it sacked itself instead of exiled.
Those were the old days of Commander design. They didn't want to let White have nice toys back then.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other sweet cards that don't see a lot of cEDH play that you want to shout out?
Yeah. Intuition is obviously a great card in this deck that I'm sure we'll talk about, but that one's in a lot of decks. Artificer's Intuition, though, that one's also very good here.
So that one is from Fifth Dawn. It is 1 and a blue for an enchantment. With blue, discard an artifact card from your hand, search your library for an artifact card with a converted mana value of 1 or less, reveal that card and put it into your hand. Then shuffle your library.
Yeah, so, it's almost sort of an artifact survival of fittest, right? You can't find your big artifacts, but if you look quick little look through the suite of artifacts that are played in the deck, this finds most of them. Discard an artifact land and go get a Lotus Bloom, and then you discard the Lotus Bloom and go get a Soul Ring or Grafdigger's Cage. So there's so many good hits for it in the deck that it actually ends up being a really, really powerful engine for you to quickly get access to really all of the cards that you want to have access to when you have Tameshi in play.
I just did a quick count of it, and I believe you have 21 potential targets for it out of the 28 total artifacts in your deck, including Ancient Den and Seed of the Synod, which are both the artifact lands, and our good old friend Esper Sentinel. Yeah, that's a lot of really good potential targets with it.
Treasure Vault, too. There's that sneaky third
Oh my god,
artifact
you
land.
forgot about Treasure Vault. I love Treasure Vault. Okay, so
Yep.
there. That's 22 out of a total of 29 artifacts in the deck. That's pretty sweet. Are there any like survival of the fittest style lines that you dump this card and that card and that card and then win? Or
Not quite. So it can't act as its own individual win con on its own. But if you have a copy artifact in play, it can get you all of the, or not in play, I should say. If you have copy artifact available in hand or graveyard, it can find you all the other pieces necessary for a loop that Tameshi can perform using copy artifact and the cards that you're finding with Artificer's Intuition.
oh, now you got me really excited. I kind of want to just go ahead and start talking about some of the win cons in this deck in that case.
Yeah, for sure. We'll start off with the copy artifact loop since I feel like I've mentioned it. I've hinted at it like 3 or 4 times, so you might as well we'll stop teasing. So the copy artifact loop uses copy artifact, an artifact land, Lotus Bloom or LED, and then one of several outlets to actually win the game using with it after. But those first 3 pieces of copy artifact, artifact land, and Lotus Bloom or LED are the kind of the first step to the combo.
All right. Walk me through it. How does it work?
Sure. I'll use Ancient Den as the default artifact land. It's the most optimal for the combo in terms of the fewest gymnastics you have to do in explaining it because of the color it produces. So the idea is with Ancient Den in play, which is artifact land that taps for a white, then Lotus Bloom in your graveyard and copy artifact in your hand as sort of the simplest setup. If you play copy artifact and have it enter as a copy of Ancient Den,
So you're 1 in a blue so far.
yeah, using 1 in a blue, you activate Tameshi for X equals 0 using copy artifact as a copy of Ancient Den to produce the white, bouncing copy artifact to hand as the land cost.
Because at that point it's a land. Okay.
Yep. And you get back the Lotus Bloom.
All right. And Lotus Bloom goes directly into play.
Yep. You bypass that suspend cost.
Okay. So far it's cost you exactly 1 in a blue.
Yep. And that's all it's going to cost you because you crack Lotus Bloom for triple blue, use 2 of it to recast the copy artifact, and do the whole thing over again.
Ah, okay.
So that will generate the infinite blue for you. And then now that you have infinite blue, you can start, instead of cracking Lotus Bloom for blue, you crack it for all the colors. So you'll have infinite colored mana of all the colors. So unfortunately, Tameshi reads once per turn in that first ability.
Right.
So you don't just draw your deck right here. However, there's a ton of cards in the deck that can be used as the final piece to let you quote unquote outlet this.
Well, you talked about one of them a little while ago with Hedron Crab, because if at that point so copy artifact will enter as a copy of the land.
Yep.
Which means that should trigger Hedron Crab, right?
Absolutely.
Ah, okay.
Yep. So you typically what I'll do is I'll just mill myself out, or not necessarily the entire deck. I'll mill myself till I find, for example, a Blind Obedience, which you can put in play. And then because you're casting copy artifact over and over again, you get to trigger Extort and drain the table.
Blind Obedience is so good.
It's such a great card, especially this deck feeds Dockside so aggressively. Like having a way to slow down Dockside at least it makes a huge difference.
Okay, that's pretty good. So that is not only a really useful stacks effect to develop early on in the game, but it also can be an outlet late game.
Yep.
Very cool.
You can also just mill your opponents out with the Hedron Crab too. They put their decks in their graveyard. Even if I'm going to do this, I typically like to mill myself out first, find, a Soul Guide Lantern, so that I can, with their decks in their graveyards, then exile their graveyards and pass the turn to them with no cards in deck. I can also, you actually can set up having just infinite birds using Codex Shredder. So you keep rebuying your Codex Shredder instead of the Lotus Bloom once you have infinite mana. Crack Codex Shredder to get back whatever your favorite instant or sorcery is, or least favorite, maybe, because you're going to counter it with Swan Song afterward.
Oh, that is some good old school cEDH right there. Infinite Swans.
Yeah, and then you can actually, as a final step, use Codex Shredder to get back an extra turn spell. So you don't even give your opponents a chance to interact. You just go to your next turn and swing with a billion birds.
Oh my god, you're on good old capture of Yingzhu and temporal manipulation.
Yep. Because like I mentioned earlier with Surveyor Scope, this is a Mystic Sanctuary deck because Tameshi can bounce the Mystic Sanctuary, and so you get to replay it every turn. So you can actually just take infinite turns.
That's kind of hot.
Yeah. So this is one that I know not every Tameshi list plays, but it's one that I've really found to be powerful to have in the deck because the extra turn spells are actually pretty useful on their own because they sort of act as pseudo explorers, which notably gives you extra land drops relative to the rest of the table, which is useful for recuperating those land drops for Tameshi.
Okay. All right. So you're taking infinite turns and eventually just kind of naturally draw into one of your ways to win the game.
Yeah, exactly. You can kind of pivot from combo to combo.
Okay.
Yep.
What other kind of combos do you have that are going to be winning the game in the deck?
So the kind of sneaky one that is pretty new to the deck as of this past summer because of Mind Over Matter being added to the deck for the combo with the One Ring. But Mind Over Matter itself actually combos with Tameshi and Artifact lands to make infinite mana.
Interesting. Okay, so Mind Over Matter, just in case someone in our audience wasn't playing back during Exodus, is 2 blue, 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 blue. And yes, I counted those out on my fingers as I was saying it. For an enchantment with choose and discard a card, tap or untap target artifact, creature, or land.
Yep. So the way this one works is if you have Tameshi and Mind Over Matter in play, you have two artifact lands or Urza's Saga. Urza's Saga works for this too because it's an enchantment. And you discard one of them to untap any mana source. You do need to be able to make white for this, of course, for Tameshi activations.
Right.
Any mana source, and then let's say the other land is already in play. So you'll float a mana with that land, activate Tameshi, bouncing it to hand, getting back the other land that you just put in the graveyard.
Okay.
Then you'll float a mana with the land you just got back, discard the land you just returned to hand to untap a mana source and float a mana again.
Okay, so you're not replaying the land from hand, you're playing the land from your graveyard with Tameshi's ability.
Yep. And so
got it.
What it does each time you do it, it nets you 1 mana. Because Tameshi costs 1 to activate. You're untapping a mana source and then putting an untapped mana source into play. So you end up netting 1 each time you do that.
Oh, that's cool. So that's another infinite mana source. And then, like we discussed a few moments ago, you're just going to be trying to either mill through your deck or draw through your deck in some other way to get to your win from there.
Yeah. So this can replace the Lotus Bloom in that copy artifact loop that I mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah, Hedron Crab obviously works. I haven't executed this combo in a game yet. It's more of like an incidental thing. I believe if you're playing Phyrexian Metamorph, it works. I'd have to look at the. No, maybe not. Like I said, I haven't executed this one in a game. It's more of just something that myself and some other Tameshi pilots realized was just in the deck because we added Mind Over Matter for the combo with the One Ring.
Oh yeah, so the One Ring, the terror of multiple formats at the moment, our 4-mana legendary artifact, indestructible. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you gain protection from everything until your next turn. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life for each burden counter on the One Ring, and tap : put a burden counter on the One Ring, then draw a card for each burden counter on the One Ring.
Yep. So One Ring, obviously, super powerful card. Taking over formats, like you mentioned. If anyone played against or with Azami back in the day, the combos is familiar to you. You activate the One Ring to draw a card, activate Mind Over Matter, discarding a card to untap it, and then you just keep doing that over and over again. Obviously, the One Ring's drawing more and more cards each time you do it, and you just draw your deck. That lets you go into whichever other combo that you want to execute.
Now, importantly, with the One Ring, there is the possibility that you draw more cards than you have in your deck. You can't always line it up perfectly to have every single card in your hand, but in most cases, when you have like 60 cards in hand, the last handful are not going to be super relevant to stopping you from winning at that point.
Probably not. Now, I think technically, because of the way that the One Ring is worded, you can respond because the counter gets put on it as a part of the resolution. I believe you can do some tricky holding of priority with and activating Mind Over Matter to create a combination of draws that will draw your deck.
Right.
If you math it out.
Yeah, that means you have to do a count on your deck in advance. And it doesn't always work perfectly, but like I said, when you got like 60 or 70 cards in hand and 3 left in your library,
yeah, exactly.
It's not too hard of a problem to solve in most cases.
And then, once people get the idea, like, oh, you draw most of your deck, they're not gonna they'll just say, how you going to win? And you show the
Yeah.
cards in your hand, and, it's whatever.
Those are. It seems like the nice part about most of those too, maybe with the exception of Lotus Bloom so far, and I guess maybe Hedron Crab, none of them are dead draws. They feel like they are still going to be just like Blind Obedience we mentioned a moment ago as one potential outlet. Like that's a really nice stacks effect.
Yep. Yep.
There's just not a lot of air that you're showing us with these win cons.
Right. Exactly. Going back to the copy artifact loop, like a few other things, other outlets, that I didn't mention, like Soul Guide Lantern. You can crack it to draw a card. That's
Mm-hmm.
let you draw your deck. Aether Spellbomb, similar card to Seal of Removal, in that you can pay a blue, sack it to bounce a creature. You can also pay a generic and draw a card with it, draw your deck that way. There's a ton of useful cards that can serve as outlets for that combo. And that's sort of been like a focus of mine when deciding, okay, what cards do I want to use in the deck to outlet the copy artifact combo? I don't want to play something that's only there to outlet the combo. It needs to be something that has a very clear purpose when I'm not winning the game. Kind of avoiding cards that are a little too cute in that regard.
Got it. All right. Now, one thing that you did mention when we were talking about some of the weaknesses of the deck is that you're not in black, you're not in green. You don't really have those unconditional tutors that just snap your game-winning cards into hand.
Yep. Yep.
So how do you tend to tackle that?
So it's kind of a twofold thing, right? So there's some the deck does have, I think, a pretty good amount of just raw card advantage between the commander and the Ristics and Mystics and Esper Sentinels, the One Rings. There's a lot of ways to draw additional cards in the deck. And sometimes that critical mass can actually just find you the pieces you need. What if it doesn't? You do have access to pretty good amount of tutor chains. I think that's maybe something that's underappreciated in Azorius, how well you can put together these chains to find the thing you need anyways, without really playing cards that you don't want to already be on. Like,
Okay.
obviously blue decks, you're gonna see, your Solve the Equation, your Mystical Tutor. These cards can find a lot of the other tutors that can get you the specific thing you need. The instant sorceries can find the Time Walk cards for the Mystic Sanctuary loop. They can also find Lorien Revealed, which finds the Mystic Sanctuary, or it can find
Oh my god,
Expedition Map.
Lorien Revealed is an island, and you can island cycle for Mystic Sanctuary. That is
Yep.
busted.
I love that card. I've gotten to cast it to draw 5 mana, draw 3, and it felt pretty good when that could have been a land. I had like 3 other lands in hand. I was like, well, thank God that I didn't draw my 4th land, because it was never going in play. But it can also find those instants and sorcery tutors can also find, your artifact tutors, Transmute Artifact, War of Invention. Those can find Expedition Map for whatever reason. You can't Lorien Revealed, but you want to find Sanctuary, or there's a different land that you want, such as Inventor's Fair or Urza's Saga. So being able to convert instant and sorcery tutors into, powerful lands that you might need is really cool.
And it's not something you usually think about in blue white, of being able to tutor up important lands that you need.
And there's a few of them in here. I mentioned Inventor's Fair off of an expedition map is absolutely a play I've made, because I want to find my One Ring. So being able to convert, you chain like a Urza Saga for expedition map for Inventor's Fair for the One Ring. So you got to find the One Ring off of your land drop from a few turns ago. Or maybe you already have the One Ring and you want to find the Minamo, which has insane synergy with the One Ring.
So Minamo School at Water's Edge is a legendary land that taps for blue, or blue tap, untap target legendary permanent.
So good with the One Ring.
Yeah.
And similar to how we were talking about with Mind Over Matter, you can respond to the activation of the One Ring, right? So you go activate One Ring, hold priority, untap it with Minamo and activate it again, you get to draw 4 cards instead of 3 for the first 2 activations, and so on.
Yeah, that's that's pretty good.
Yeah, intuition. I know I mentioned it before. It's obvious, very powerful in the sense that it can find whatever you need, and usually Tameshi can get all of it back if you create a pile of just 3 artifacts and/or enchantments. Like a not uncommon line to take with it. If you don't have any of the pieces that you need for the copy artifact loop already, you can find the copy artifact, the Artificer's Intuition, and then an artifact land or Lotus Bloom, and you can, or if you find the artifact, I guess artifact land is probably the most ideal. You can have get all 3 of those back and utilize intuition or Artificer's Intuition to go get that last piece that you need for the combo.
And that also gets around if they say, okay, you can keep the Lotus Bloom in hand. So you're not stuck suspending it.
Right, exactly. You get back the Artificer's Intuition, pay a blue, discard the Lotus Bloom to go get the Ancient Den, and then you use Tameshi and just put the Lotus Bloom in play, and now you're recuperating some of that mana that you just spent doing the Artificer's Intuition sequence.
That's really, really sweet. Hey everybody, Future John here, just reminding you that Gemstone Mine is a part of CCO Media Group, and as such, we are sponsored by FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. If any of these cards that DJ has been talking about sound really, really cool, and you want to give them a try, why not save a little bit of money doing so? You can check out some of the cards mentioned in this episode on FusionGamingOnline.com. And guess what? Those prices are in Canadian dollars. So if you, like me, are in the good old US of A, it's practically like getting money back. And if that's not good enough, you can save additional money using the promo code on your screen right now. Promo codes are also in the description. Save yourself some money on cards you want to buy anyway. That's FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. All right, so why don't we talk next about what really makes a good opening hand with this deck?
Yeah. So obviously it's fun to talk about the wins, but obviously you have to start somewhere. And I think the default thing that I sort of look for is having a good amount of mana. You want to have a clear path to what you're going to be doing 2-3 turns after the start of the game. Having multiple sources of mana, preferably some sort of ramp in there, is pretty important. And I know that's not necessarily anything unique for this deck. And then also some way to interact with the table. We kind of touched on that before, but it's really important to have some way of making sure that you get out of those first few turns, because you have a commander that is very likely to help you find the thing that you're missing through just a passive draws if somebody bounces something, or there's so many pieces in the deck that synergize with Tameshi in some way that your first couple draws are very likely to find you some way to start turning Tameshi into a very consistent source of value. So really what you want to do is make sure you have the pieces that allow you to take more turns, because you'll find the rest of it as the game goes on. You want to make sure that the game goes on.
Got it. The classic control strategy.
Exactly. I've kind of likened the play style to a bit of like a Legacy Miracles play style, where you're really just, you want to develop that counterbalance, that Sensei's top in the early game, so that you can then start looking towards, okay, how am I going to win?
All right. So what are you prioritizing then first? This doesn't necessarily seem like a deck where it's turn one Tameshi or bust.
No, absolutely not. I mean, it's definitely, if I see the turn one Tameshi and there's some sort of follow-up, like, that's gold. Whether it's, land crypt Tameshi and then there's a clear thing to do on turn 2, obviously that's great. But really what I want to do is, all right, can I hit a couple land drops with this hand so that I'm set to use Tameshi later if I need to? I want to then find that card that gives me that card velocity, whether it's cards going to hand or cards going to graveyard, like a Hedron Crab or even like a Codex Shredder do. Some way to say, okay, I have Tameshi in play. How can I get value out of it via the graveyard or just raw cards in hand?
Right.
Ideally, I want to develop mana first,
Mm-hmm.
and then based on kind of what's in hand, then make the decision, okay, is it time to develop Tameshi so that the next turn I can untap and be able to use it? Or do I want to develop this Drannith Magistrate and hold up interaction, waiting for a better window to resolve Tameshi where I'm not exposing myself to somebody having a piece of removal and jamming a win? So basing it off sort of what cards you see in that opener to inform you, okay, is this a Tameshi hand? Is this a sit back, develop a little bit more slowly, and create a better opening for myself to start doing the Tameshi thing a few turns from now?
And what kind of game plans do you find that you are trying to, or do you find the deck is struggling against or particularly strong against?
The classic control problem in multiplayer is like what to do if there's multiple fast combo decks or very
Right.
proactively slanted decks, because Magic players are greedy, so they see the win attempt and they gotta jam it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, not everybody does that, especially not if you're holding up, showing interaction or representing it at least, right? You know, the classic control player's got 2 islands on tap. Maybe I shouldn't jam into it.
Right.
It's not always it's but people don't always respect that. So when that happens, first player doesn't respect the possibility of interaction. I'm not going to not lose the game, or I'm not going to not interact with a win. So I interact, and then same turn cycle, somebody else goes for the win. Sometimes there's not much you could do about that unless you got a loaded hand,
Right.
especially in the early game where you haven't been able to accrue that value yet, and maybe didn't get to develop all the cards you wanted to develop in the first few turns yet. That's sort of like a point of the game where you're a bit exposed. But if you can get through that, and the game becomes much more, what creatures are in play and players interacting a lot on the stack, just because of the raw card draw that has probably been happening in the table, that's really where the deck starts to shine, because it can do that one for one interaction, I think, a lot better than a lot of decks, because of how Tameshi can rebuy those permanents that we talked about earlier, like the seals. So I don't have to spend cards in hand to deal with creatures on board. I can just sit back with counter magic in hand while I use Tameshi to start dealing with whatever starts popping up from the other decks.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it almost seems like a slower but more consistent version of something like Rashmi or Curious Control, where you know that you're doesn't really matter what your top deck is because you're going to get the interaction piece back out of your graveyard on your turn anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So now you can kind of sandbag the stuff in hand more, because you have some amount of way to deal with the threats already developed, which, and in a way that doesn't cost you cards in hand. So where unsummon would just be one for one interaction, a seal of removal is essentially a 1 for 0, because you can get it back. And it puts a card, it really, maybe even like a 2 for 1, 2 for 0, because it puts a card back in your hand when you activate Tameshi to get it back.
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty sweet answer to trying to play control in a multiplayer game. How about weaknesses? What are the things that people should be aware of going into it? We kind of talked a little bit about, well, it's a two-color deck, it's slower because we don't have red in it. What kind of matchups really present problems for Tameshi?
Obviously the faster pods that we talked about, but like maybe some specific cards that really I don't like seeing on the other side of the table. Grave Hate, your Douthies, Rest in Pieces. Those ones are particularly, especially Rest in Peace, particularly problematic, because I can't actually use, I can't use that Seal of Removal on the Douthie, because it's just going to bounce it, and now the seal of removal is gone forever because of it sacks itself before it bounces the Douthie. So now I put my seal of removal under the Douthie. The Douthie could come back the next turn. So I haven't really solved my problem long term. So Douthie's...
Right. In that case, you've 0 for 1 to yourself.
Yeah, literally. So I can't really use the cards that Tameshi wants to use to deal with the board state in the same way when there's Grave Hate in play. I've also, I've been hit by like a well-timed Endurance, which is annoying. I don't lose the cards forever, but it's still what was a
lot of setup that's been
exactly.
reset.
It used to have a really nice toolbox of things I can get back. Now I'm only operating with the cards in my hand, where now, that 4-color deck that has or a wider toolbox of effects. Now they say, okay, my hand's better because I have access to these good red cards and these good green cards. And I just say, okay, well, I have some counter magic in hand.
Right. In that part, you're just kind of at the generic Azorius floor of interaction.
Exactly. Curse Totem is another one that disrupts Tameshi's ability to take advantage of the graveyard as a second hand there.
All right. Well, we're kind of closing in on the end of this episode. So, DJ, what would you want someone to take away from this discussion of Tameshi? What would you say if someone is on the fence and said, I don't know, this deck sounds kind of neat, but is it really for me?
Yeah, from playing it, like I hadn't really experienced Azorius before playing the deck. I always had green, always had black in my decks. Did dabble a little bit with Teamer, Malcolm, but this was the first time I really played like a Azorius control deck, and I wasn't really sure about it at start. I started playing it, and I was like, wow, I really love the play patterns of this deck. The feeling that it's sort of, if I just do what the deck wants me to do, in the sense of playing the control game, try not to lose, just accrue value with my commander, I'll assemble a way to win the game over time. And that was like such a cool feeling as I'm playing. Like, I just have to do what I'm supposed to do, and that is going to give me the win if I keep doing it long enough.
That's the Azorius philosophy.
Yeah. And then beyond that, just it feels like a really cool, unique commander. Like, we talked about all these cards that only Tameshi plays, or maybe only a few other decks might play. I know no one else is playing Surveyor's Scope in cEDH. Just being able to play these really cool, unique cards in a competitive setting and have them, like, have the table read them and be like, oh my god, that's so good with Commander, is like, feels really good.
That's awesome. Well, DJ, thank you once again for joining us for this episode of Hot Brews on Gemstone Mine. One more time for the folks at home, where can people find you, especially if they have questions about this list?
I'm on Twitter, DJ Yavimaya, and then Discord, same name. I'm on, the competitive EDH server. I'm on the Azorius server, where we talk about Tameshi with a few other people, a handful of other deck-specific servers and gameplay-oriented servers and whatnot. So I'm around, pretty easily accessible. Probably on anybody watching this video, if they're on Discord, I'm probably on one of the same servers as them.
And you can find us in the comments on YouTube, where we are Gemstone Mine Podcast. You can add us on Twitter, where we are at Gemstone Mine MTG, and you can send us an email, gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. DJ, once again, thank you so much for coming on with us. I hope it was enjoyable for you as it was for me, getting to go on one heck of a wild ride with this deck.
Absolutely. I definitely love talking about the decks that I play, so this was fun.
All right, well, until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.